In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we read about the man of sin or lawlessness. People generally agree that this passage is about the Antichrist. Speaking of the day of the Lord, we read, quote, "For that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of destruction, the one opposing and raising himself above everything that is called God, or every object of worship, so as to seat himself in the temple of God, displaying that he himself is God." End quote. 2 Thessalonians 2, 3-4. This video will explain how St. Paul's prophecy about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 has been strikingly fulfilled in our time. Before we explain that, it should be noted that there's a textual variant in the Greek manuscripts for verse 3. The majority of Greek manuscripts read man of sin, that is, anthropos tes hamartias, while some read man of lawlessness, that is, anthropos tes anamias. We will use man of sin in this video, but none of these points are impacted if one chooses the reading man of lawlessness. Now, the first thing to notice in this prophecy is that St. Paul connects the revelation of the man of sin with he apostasia, that is, the apostasy. The man of sin will come as part of the prophesied great apostasy. Although the Greek word apostasia can, depending on the usage and context, refer to a political rebellion or a religious apostasy, the context of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the established meaning of the term apostasy in Christian theology from basically the beginning of the church indicates that the prophecy is about a full-scale religious apostasy, and the man of sin figures prominently into it. Viewers of our material know that we deal extensively and in detail with how this prophesied great apostasy has been fulfilled in our time by the events in Rome after Vatican II. The city of Rome, not the Catholic Church, has been overtaken by apostate and antichrist antipopes in the final days, in accord with scriptural and Catholic prophecies. This has given rise to a counter-church, the Vatican II sect, which is led from Rome in the last days. This counter-church purports to be or presents itself as the Catholic Church, but it is not. It opposes the true Catholic Church, which exists in a remnant of faithful traditional Catholics. What has happened with the post-Vatican II sect and the post-Vatican II antipopes in Rome in our day perfectly fulfills the apocalyptic prophecies about the beast, the whore of Babylon, the Roman king who is wounded and then has his image honored, the 7 Roman kings, the beast rising when 5 are fallen, etc. That's all covered in our material. In this video, we will see that the true fulfillment of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is also connected with these events. Now, when one thinks of the post-Vatican II revolution and the apostasy that ensued, if you had to pick just one thing or event or series of events that is the most notorious, something that jumps out and sums up the entire apostasy in Rome in these final days, what event would you choose? What act or thing is the most notorious illustration of the apostasy? What event or series of events most powerfully captures the rejection of the traditional Catholic faith and the spiritual destruction after Vatican II? I think most observers would agree. The single most notorious event or series of events in the entire post-Vatican II apostasy is the Assisi World Day of Prayer for Peace with representatives of the various heretical sects and false pagan religions of the world. The first Assisi prayer meeting was organized by Antipope John Paul II in 1986. It is the single most notorious act in the entire Vatican II apostasy, and basically everyone who follows or studies these issues knows it. Since the Assisi prayer meeting was so notorious, so revolutionary, and so symbolic of everything that has transpired, it would make sense that an event of such unique significance to the apostasy would be foretold in Scripture's prophecy about he apostasia, the apostasy, and as we will see, it was. Now, Scripture teaches that the so-called God or gods of non-Christian and pagan religions are not God but devils. The people who don't worship the God of Christianity are not worshiping God but devils. That's one reason the Catholic Church has always forbidden any kind of joint prayer or worship with members of other religions. In his 1928 encyclical Mortalis Animos, Pope Pius XI declared that the Catholic Church has always forbidden Catholics from participating in non-Catholic assemblies. He also denounced conventions or meetings which featured unbelievers or members of various religions. He identified movements for them as a rejection of the true faith. There were efforts for such gatherings among some non-Catholics back in 1928, and they represented false ecumenism, which is why Pope Pius XI condemned them, but they were primarily discussion meetings or joint prayers among heretics who claimed to be Christians. Until John Paul II came along, nothing like the Assisi prayer event in terms of an actual prayer meeting with representatives of all the major religions of the world, including all kinds of pagans, had ever taken place. Never before in history, from the time God created man, had the followers of basically all the major false gods under the sun been gathered together in one place to, quote, worship. The Assisi event was world historic. It was John Paul II, a man claiming to be a Catholic pope, who made it happen in 1986. And when you think about it, only someone in the modern era, in possession of modern means of communication and travel, who had the international fame, charisma, and clout of John Paul II, could organize such a day of worship at which the leaders of all the major religions in the world would show up in one place to pray to their various false gods. John Paul II invited the worshippers of every kind of false god to come to pray at Assisi. In all, there were over 150 different religious leaders spending the day together, fasting and praying to their so-called god or gods. They included heretics of various stripes, Jews and Muslims who reject the Holy Trinity and the deity of Christ, Buddhists, the followers of Voodoo, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Jains, Sikhs, American Indian pagans, the followers of the Baha'i religion, and others. At John Paul II's event, there were worshippers of Buddha, snakes, spirits of various kinds, and even the Great Thumb, among many others. Now, by organizing this world historic event of idolatry and false worship, Anti-Pope John Paul II wasn't just endorsing and facilitating idolatry. He was certainly doing that, but he was also committing idolatry himself. That's because the very act of arranging such an event is a public profession of faith in false gods. It is a profession of faith in all the false gods worshipped at Assisi. Think of it this way. If someone organizes a day of prayer and worship for a particular cause, the person doesn't call for pagan, quote, gods to be included in the worship unless he professes that those, quote, gods are real and can respond to prayer and worship. Hence, the very fact that John Paul II arranged an event like Assisi, which specifically called for other gods to be worshipped, in addition to many other things he said and did, was a public profession of belief in the power of false gods. He was therefore a public idolater. Assisi was the most notorious event in the history of the Vatican to apostasy, and at Assisi every kind of, quote, god or object of worship was worshipped. Now, we saw that in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, St. Paul describes the man of sin as the one opposing and raising himself above everything that is called God or every object of worship. Doesn't the phrase in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, everything that is called God or every object of worship, sound exactly like what was represented at Assisi? Yes, it does. The description in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, everything that is called God or every object of worship, perfectly matches what was represented at Assisi. That's because St. Paul was actually describing the Assisi event, as we will see. In fact, the phrase in the Greek in 2 Thessalonians 2:4 for everything that is called God or every object of worship is panta legomenon theon e sabasma. It's very similar to the phrase St. Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 8:5, where he refers to idols and false gods with the words legomenoi theoi, or so-called gods. In describing he apostasia, that is the apostasy, St. Paul tells us that the man of sin will be the one opposing and raising himself above every kind of thing called God, every so-called god or object of worship. Now, the word in the Greek which is translated as opposing is the participle antikamenos. It's from the verb antikemai. Antikemai, which is a combination of anti, meaning against, and kemai, meaning I lie, I recline, I am set, is frequently used for things that oppose one another in some way. That's why numerous translations render the word in this verse as opposing. The verb antikemai is used to describe various forms of opposition between people or things in one way or another, but antikemai can simply mean positional opposition. Antikemai can simply refer to lying or reclining or being placed across from or opposite something in a positional way. In other words, it can mean being face-to-face with someone or being situated across from him. Hence, antikamenos in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, which is sometimes translated as the one opposing, can simply mean the one reclining across from, or the one lying across from, or the one sitting across from, or being set or situated across from, etc. It can mean one who is face-to-face with someone else. Hence, 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 could be translated this way, quote, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of sin be revealed, the son of destruction, the one reclining across from and raising himself above everything that is called God or every object of worship." End quote. Now watch this. At the 1986 Assisi event, John Paul II and the representatives of every so-called God and object of worship were arrayed together on a platform. John Paul II, as the leader and host, was located prominently in the center. And when the various pagans and false worshippers got their chance to worship, they had to descend from the platform to a podium. They had to walk down various steps, descending from a higher spot to a lower spot, in order to reach the podium where they faced their so-called God and offered prayers and worship. That means that John Paul II was located above, where the various unbelievers worshipped. John Paul II had raised himself above the spot where they offered prayers to the various so-called gods and objects of worship. Further, as the pagans and unbelievers worshipped their so-called God or gods at the podium, they offered prayers toward the object of their worship, just as one would expect. They faced their so-called God or gods. They said prayers in the direction of where they believed him to be. The pagans and the unbelievers were thus positionally opposite, or directly across from, or face to face with what they were worshiping. The object of their worship was thus across from, or positionally opposite to them. And as they did this, where was John Paul II? He was not only on the platform raised and elevated above them, as we saw, but he was also reclining directly behind them, in a straight line back from where they were. That means that just as the unbelievers were positionally opposite or across from the object of their worship, John Paul II, reclining above and directly behind them, was also positionally opposite or across from the object of their worship. 2 Thessalonians 2, 3-4, foretelling the coming apostasy, says that the man of sin is the one reclining across from and raising himself above everything that is called God or every object of worship. The passage is a perfect description of Assisi and Antipope John Paul II's position at Assisi. John Paul II was reclining across from and raising himself above all the so-called gods and objects of worship, exactly as it says in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3-4, and this happened at a world historic event that is the single most notorious event of apostasia, the apostasy, the very thing St. Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3-4. St. Paul's description of the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2 perfectly matches the Assisi event and John Paul II's position there, because, as should now be clear, St. Paul was describing Antipope John Paul II as the man of sin, and he was describing the Assisi prayer meeting as the signature event of the prophesied apostasy. And the same man, Antipope John Paul II, who so perfectly fits this description in 2 Thessalonians 2 concerning the man of sin, just happens to also be a Roman king who was wounded, exactly as it says in the Apocalypse about the Antichrist or head of the beast. He also just happens to be the one who, after having been wounded and recovering, in a turn of events that shocked the world and gave him greater charisma and influence to get away with things like Assisi, had his image honored through a false canonization ceremony, exactly as it says in the Apocalypse about the Antichrist having his image honored. That ceremony became the instrument through which multitudes were implicated in idolatry by professing that a notorious idolater is a, quote, saint, as our material explains. The same man, John Paul II, just happens to be the sixth Roman king of the Vatican city-state. He thus arose when 5 Roman kings are fallen, exactly as it says in the Apocalypse about the rising of the beast in its full form during the reign of the 6th king, when 5 are fallen. He is the same man who hid and buried the third secret of Fatima, yet somehow got himself recognized as the hero of the false third secret of Fatima. He is the same man who proclaimed that he and everyone else is Jesus Christ and God, as we proved in our video, quote, St. John Paul II exposed. John Paul II was the man of sin. That's why his activity so precisely matches the prophecies in 2 Thessalonians 2 and the Apocalypse. In fact, as I mentioned, the verb kami can mean I recline, and anti-kami, which is what the man of sin does, is to recline opposite or across from something. Well, when you look up the word recline, it means to lean backward or sit backward in a relaxed position. So the man of sin will lean or sit backward in a relaxed position while he is above and across from every so-called god or object of worship. At Assisi, reclining is exactly what John Paul II was doing. He was sitting or leaning back in a relaxed position, while being above and across from the so-called gods or objects of worship. St. Paul's description of anti-Pope John Paul II reclining or leaning back in a relaxed way at this signature event of apostasia was perfect. It also makes perfect sense that the participle antikamenos in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, which could be translated as opposing or reclining across from, would be fulfilled through the man of sin displaying positional opposition during an event, rather than through an opposition of hostility to all the so-called gods. For the false gods of non-Christians are, as we've seen, devils. They are already under Satan's control. They are part of Satan's kingdom, and his kingdom is not divided against itself. As Jesus says in Luke 11:17-18, quote, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. And if Satan also is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand?" End quote. It makes perfect sense, therefore, that the man of sin would host an event that characterizes apostasia, during which he is positionally across from and above every so-called god and object of worship, rather than that he would try to knock down or oppose the worship of false gods in a hostile way, for those so-called gods are in fact devils. Rather, Satan wants to put the worship of all the false gods he has invented on a spiritual par with the true God, and that's what the man of sin tried to do through Assisi and his overall apostasy and indifferentism. In the full version of this video, we will cover numerous other aspects of this matter. It will show how John Paul II also precisely fit the prophecy about the man of sin sitting in the temple of God, displaying that he himself is God. In fact, anti-Pope John Paul II displayed and proclaimed that he is God, while sitting in the temple of God, in a way that no one else in Christian history did. That was proven in detail in our video, quote, St. John Paul II Exposed. The longer version of this video will also demonstrate that properly identifying the temple of God in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, and thus what Scripture declares to be the New Testament temple of God, further proves that the traditional Catholic faith is the one true faith of Jesus Christ, and that the Catholic Church is the one true Church of Jesus Christ, outside of which there is no salvation. However, during the prophesied apostasy, the temple of God, the temple that belongs to Christ's true church and normally represents where the leader of the true church is located, is overtaken by the man of sin, the veneration of his image, and the end times counter-church, the whore of Babylon, as part of the final deception. The full version of this video will also address and refute a common objection people advance on the matter of the man of sin and the Antichrist. But what we've covered should make it clear that anti-Pope John Paul II was the man of sin. Besides everything else, he was the one reclining across from and raising himself above everything that is called God or every object of worship at the signature event of the prophesied apostasy, exactly as it says in 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4. Recognizing this gives people an understanding of the gravity of the evil and the true nature of the crisis that we are dealing with. Among many other reasons, John Paul II was uniquely significant because his revolutionary acts of heresy, false ecumenism, and religious indifferentism are what paved the way for subsequent acts of a similar nature that now regularly occur in the Vatican II sect. What John Paul II did in the area of mortal sins against the First Commandment and the acceptance of false religions and false gods is now repeated and commonly accepted all over the world by people who claim to be Catholic only because John Paul II took the bold and revolutionary steps to commit public apostasy in an unprecedented way, to do what before him no one had done and what had always been considered unthinkable and anathema. Once he took those revolutionary steps of apostasy, people all over the counter-church began to do the same kinds of things. His acts and false teachings are what now characterize the indifferentism and faithlessness of the great harlot, and it is through her indifferentism and false ecumenism that she leads people into mortal sin and heresy on a regular basis. By means of his apostasy, John Paul II attempted to destroy God's commandments, his teachings, and his program on earth. Multitudes followed him into heresy, apostasy, and idolatry, and multitudes more are currently accepting it through the veneration of his image, which is a crucial aspect of the prophecies about the Antichrist. He was the man of sin, the son of destruction.
You know what it is you know, we shall destroy the program. Destroy the program.